The coffee tasted wrong the moment it touched my lips, bitter in a way that had nothing to do with the beans, and when I looked up, my son Felix was watching me with eyes I'd never seen before, cold and calculating, like he was timing something. That's when I knew the life insurance policy he'd insisted I sign last month wasn't about love at all. I set the cup down carefully, my hands steadier than they had any right to be, and watched my 42-year-old son shift uncomfortably in the kitchen chair across from me. This kitchen where I'd made him thousands of meals, bandaged his scraped knees, helped him with homework until my eyes burned from the strain. The same kitchen where he now sat, waiting for me to die. You know, when you become a mother, nobody tells you about the particular kind of fear that comes with loving someone more than your own life. They tell you about sleepless nights and scraped knees and the terror of letting them walk to school alone for the first time. But they don't tell you about the deeper fear, the one that grows slowly over decades. The fear that all your love, all your sacrifice, all the pieces of yourself that you give away might not be enough. That despite everything you've done, everything you've been, the person you love most in the world might still become a stranger. I thought about this as I sat there, looking at my son's face and recognizing nothing familiar in it. This was the child I'd carried for 9 months, feeling him move and kick and hiccup inside me. This was the baby who'd latched onto my breast with such desperate hunger that the nurses joked he was making up for lost time. This was the toddler who'd cried inconsolably whenever I left the room, who'd wrapped his tiny arms around my neck and whispered, "Don't go, Mommy," in that heartbreaking way that made me cancel plans, turn down opportunities, reshape my entire life around his need for me. And now, he was sitting in my kitchen, waiting for me to die so he could collect money for my death. The kitchen itself felt different now, poisoned by his presence and his intentions. This room had been the heart of our family for 47 years. The cabinet still bore the dents from when Felix had been learning to walk and had pulled himself up on the drawer handles. The floor still had a slight discoloration near the sink where he'd spilled grape juice when he was 6, despite my best efforts with bleach and scrubbing. The table where we now sat, this same table, had been where he'd done his homework every night, where I'd helped him practice spelling words and multiplication tables, where we'd had countless conversations about his day, his dreams, his problems. I remembered sitting here with him when he was 8 years old, both of us crying because his goldfish had died, and he'd been so worried about where goldfish go when they die, whether there was a heaven for pets, whether Goldie would be lonely. I'd held his small hands and promised him that love doesn't disappear just because someone dies, that Goldie would always be part of our family's story. I'd believed that so completely, the power of love to transcend everything, to overcome any obstacle, to bind us together forever. Now I wondered if love was just another name for willful blindness. You have to understand, I've been a mother for over 4 decades, and in all that time I thought I knew every expression that could cross my child's face. I knew the sleepy confusion of early mornings before school when his hair would stick up in impossible directions and he'd stumble to the breakfast table like a tiny drunk person, barely able to keep his eyes open until the orange juice hit his system. I knew the guilty flush when he'd done something he shouldn't have, the way his ears would turn red first, then the color would creep across his cheeks like spilled paint, and he'd get that particular stiff-shouldered posture that meant he was preparing to lie, but wasn't quite ready to commit to it yet. I knew the determined set of his jaw when he was working through a difficult problem, the way he'd press his lips together and furrow his brow, unconsciously mimicking his father's expression of concentration. I knew the way his face would light up when he figured something out, like sunrise breaking over the mountains, pure joy radiating from every feature. I knew his angry face, his disappointed face, his embarrassed face, his proud face. I knew the way he looked when he was sick, pale and drawn and younger than his years. I knew the way he looked when he was happy, bright and open and beautiful. I thought I knew the complete catalog of my child's expressions. But this look, this cold patience, this calculating assessment, this was new. This was the face of a stranger wearing my son's features, and it was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The realization settled into my chest like the tip of a needle, sharp and precise. But it wasn't just the physical sensation of shock that overwhelmed me. It was the complete reorganization of reality that comes when something you thought you knew absolutely turns out to be a lie. My own son had brought me poisoned coffee and was sitting there watching me drink it, waiting for whatever he'd put in it to work. But more than that, he'd been planning this. The life insurance policy he'd talked me into signing. Just in case, Mom, you know how expensive funerals are these days, and I want to make sure everything's taken care of, suddenly made perfect sense in the most horrible way possible. I thought back to that conversation, which had happened here in this same kitchen about 6 weeks ago. Felix had been unusually solicitous that day, bringing flowers from the grocery store, cheap carnations that looked like an afterthought, but I'd been so pleased that he'd thought of me at all. He'd made a big production of brewing coffee using the expensive beans he'd brought, fussing over the temperature and the timing like he was performing some kind of ritual. "Mom," he'd said, settling into that same chair he occupied now. "I've been thinking about some practical stuff. Boring stuff, but important." He'd pulled out a folder full of papers, official-looking documents with dense text and corporate logos. "I know you and Dad never really talked about life insurance much, but now that he's gone, I'm worried about what happens if something happens to you." The way he'd phrased it should have been a red flag. If something happens to you, like my death was an eventuality he was actively planning for rather than a distant possibility he was preparing against. But at the time, I'd been touched by what seemed like mature concern for my perpetually irresponsible son. Felix had always been the kind of person who lived paycheck to paycheck, who called me when his car broke down or his rent was due, who treated money like something that appeared magically rather than something that had to be earned and managed. So when he suddenly started talking about funeral costs and estate planning and making sure everything was taken care of, I'd seen it as evidence that he was finally growing up, finally taking responsibility not just for himself, but for me. I'd been proud of him, actually proud, thinking that maybe all those years of sacrifice had paid off, that my little boy had finally become the kind of man who took care of his mother instead of the other way around. I'd signed the papers without reading them carefully, trusting his explanation that it was just basic coverage, nothing fancy. He'd guided my hand to the signature lines, pointing out where I needed to initial, chatting casually about how this would give him peace of mind, knowing that I'd be taken care of no matter what happened. Taken care of. The phrase had sounded so loving at the time. Now it sounded like a threat. I kept my face carefully neutral, the way I'd learned to do during 47 years of marriage to Felix's father, a man who taught me that showing weakness only invited more pain. My late husband Robert had been a different kind of predator, one who took pieces of my confidence and independence slowly, systematically, until I barely remembered the young woman who'd once had dreams beyond keeping house and raising children. Robert had been handsome when we'd met, charming in that easy way that some men have, the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of anything. I was 23 and working as a secretary at an insurance company. Oh, the irony of that detail didn't escape me now. And I thought I was so sophisticated, so modern, supporting myself in the big city. Robert was a junior executive, 10 years older, with a corner office and expensive suits, and a way of making me feel like I was the most fascinating woman he'd ever met. The courtship had been whirlwind and romantic. Flowers delivered to my desk, weekend trips to the coast, dinners at restaurants where I felt underdressed and overwhelmed, but tried to hide it because I wanted so desperately to belong in his world. He'd proposed after 6 months, presenting me with a ring that seemed impossibly elegant and expensive, talking about the life we'd build together, the house we'd have, the family we'd raise. What I didn't understand then, what took me decades to recognize, was that Robert had never seen me as a partner. He'd seen me as a project, a pretty young thing he could shape into the perfect corporate wife. The process had been so gradual, so insidious, that I didn't even realize it was happening. First, he'd suggested I quit my job after we got married. "There's no need for you to work anymore, Kiswo," he'd said, his arm around my shoulders as we looked at the house he'd picked out for us, a beautiful colonial in the suburbs with a white picket fence and a garden that I'd supposedly have time to tend. "I make enough to support us both, and wouldn't it be nice to have time for yourself? You could take art classes, learn to cook properly, maybe do some volunteer work." It had sounded reasonable, even appealing. I was tired of office politics and demanding bosses, tired of the daily grind of commuting and deadlines. The idea of being a housewife, of having a beautiful home to take care of maybe writing the novel I'd always talked about, it had seemed like a luxury rather than a trap. But once I'd given up my job, given up my financial independence, the suggestions had become more insistent. Robert had opinions about everything, how I should dress, what I should read, which friends I should see. He never forbade me anything outright. He was too clever for that. Instead, he had expressed disappointment when I made choices he didn't approve of, or he'd make subtle comments that made me doubt my own judgment. "Are you sure you want to wear that dress?" he'd ask, not unkindly, but with a little furrow in his brow that suggested I was making a mistake. "It's just that it's a bit young for you, don't you think? I want you to look sophisticated, not like you're trying too hard. Or, I ran into Susan's husband at the club today. He mentioned that Susan's been filling your head with some pretty radical ideas about women's liberation. I just hope you're not taking that nonsense too seriously. You're too intelligent to fall for that kind of propaganda. It had taken me years, literally years, to realize that Robert's version of love was really a form of control, that his concern for me was actually a systematic dismantling of my confidence and autonomy. By the time I understood what had happened, I had a toddler, no work experience, no savings of my own, and no idea how to support myself. I was trapped, and Robert knew it, and I think somewhere deep down, he enjoyed it. The control had been so subtle, so gradual, that I'd mistaken it for devotion. Robert would insist on handling all the finances because numbers aren't your strong suit, sweetheart. He'd discourage friendships with women he deemed bad influences because he just wanted what was best for me. He'd make decisions about our social life, our living arrangements, our future plans, always with that same concerned expression, always framed as protection rather than domination. When Felix was born, Robert's control had taken on a new dimension. He'd decided I was too emotional, too protective, too likely to coddle our son. He'd undermined my parenting decisions constantly, always in front of Felix, always with that same patronizing tone that suggested I was well-meaning but fundamentally incompetent. "Let mommy fuss over you," he'd say when I tried to comfort a crying toddler Felix. "But remember, big boys don't need all this attention." Or when I'd try to set boundaries or enforce consequences. "Your mother worries too much. She doesn't understand that boys need to learn to be tough." The worst part was that it had worked. By the time Felix was a teenager, he'd absorbed his father's attitude toward me completely. I was the soft touch, the emotional one, the parent you went to when you wanted sympathy, but not when you needed real advice or real help. I was useful for clean clothes and home-cooked meals and unconditional love, but I wasn't someone whose opinions mattered or whose intelligence deserved respect. Robert had trained our son to see me as he saw me, as someone whose primary value lay in her willingness to serve others, whose needs were secondary to everyone else's, whose very existence was justified only by how useful she could be to the people around her. And I'd enabled this dynamic because I hadn't known how to stop it, because I'd been so ground down by decades of subtle invalidation that I'd started to believe it myself. But at least Robert had never tried to kill me. At least there had been some twisted version of love in his control, some genuine desire to possess me rather than destroy me. This thing with Felix, this was something else entirely. This was colder, more calculated, more complete in its betrayal. Felix was drumming his fingers against the table, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood, but now it sounded different. Now it sounded like impatience, like he was counting down to something. The rhythm was irregular, anxious, and I found myself remembering all the other times I'd heard that same drumming over the years. When he was 7 and had broken my favorite vase while playing ball in the house, he'd sat at the same table drumming his fingers while I swept up the pieces, waiting to see if I'd figured out it was him. When he was 15 and had been caught cheating on a math test, he'd drummed his fingers in the principal's office while we discussed his punishment. When he was 25 and had to tell me he'd been fired from another job, he'd drummed his fingers against his leg while explaining why it wasn't really his fault, why his boss had been unreasonable, why the whole situation had been a misunderstanding. Always that drumming had meant he was hiding something, that there was more to the story than what he was telling me. But I'd made excuses for him, the way mothers do. I'd attributed it to nervousness rather than deception, to anxiety rather than guilt. I'd been so determined to see the best in him, so invested in believing that my love could overcome any flaw in his character, that I'd ignored all the warning signs that had been there for decades. Looking at him now, I could see the pattern so clearly, it was almost laughable. Felix had never taken responsibility for anything in his entire life. Every failure, every disappointment, every consequence had been someone else's fault. His teachers were unfair, his bosses were unreasonable, his girlfriends were crazy, his friends were bad influences, and I, his loving, enabling mother, had always been there to clean up the mess, to provide emotional support and financial assistance and unconditional forgiveness. I thought I was being a good mother, showing him that love doesn't depend on performance, that family means never giving up on each other. But what I'd actually been teaching him was that actions don't have consequences, that charm and manipulation can get you out of any situation, that there would always be someone willing to sacrifice their own well-being for his comfort. I'd created a monster, and now that monster was trying to kill me. I pretended to take another sip, barely letting the liquid touch my lips, and made a small appreciative sound. The coffee was definitely poisoned. I could taste something metallic and harsh underneath the familiar bitterness of the dark roast. Whatever he'd put in it, he hadn't been particularly subtle about it, which told me this wasn't his first attempt. You don't develop that kind of casual confidence with poison unless you've practiced. "This is good coffee, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Where did you get it?" "Oh, just picked it up at that new place downtown," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Felix had always been a terrible liar, even as a child. He'd get this same fidgety quality, this same inability to maintain eye contact. As a mother, I'd actually been proud of this trait. It meant he had a conscience, that lying made him uncomfortable, that he was fundamentally a good person who occasionally made bad choices. Now I realized I'd been wrong about that too. Felix wasn't uncomfortable with lying because he was fundamentally honest. He was uncomfortable with lying because he was fundamentally bad at it. There was a difference, and it was a crucial one. "Thought you might like something special," he added, and now I could hear the false note in his voice, the slightly too bright tone that meant he was working hard to sound normal. Special. The word hung in the air between us like a curse. Special coffee laced with whatever substance he'd calculated would kill me slowly enough to look natural, but quickly enough to satisfy his timeline. Special attention from a son who'd barely called me once a month for the past 5 years. Special visits that had started just after I'd signed those insurance papers, visits where he always brought coffee, always insisted I drink it while it was hot, always watched me with that same calculating expression I was seeing now. The pieces were falling into place in my mind, forming a picture so ugly I almost couldn't bear to look at it directly. But I forced myself to see it clearly, to understand the full scope of what my son had planned for me. Because if I was going to survive this, if I was going to turn the tables on him, the way every instinct in my body was telling me I needed to, I had to understand exactly what I was up against. I'd been feeling unwell for weeks now, dizzy spells, nausea, a persistent headache that wouldn't respond to any medication. At 71, I'd attributed it to age, to the stress of living alone since Robert died 3 years ago, to the loneliness that seemed to seep into my bones during the long winter evenings. My doctor had run tests, found nothing conclusive, suggested it might be seasonal depression or perhaps the early stages of some age-related condition that would need to be monitored. But now I wondered if those symptoms had started right around the time Felix began visiting more frequently, always bringing coffee, always insisting I drink it while it was hot. Now I was calculating backwards, trying to remember when the headaches had started, when I'd first felt that strange metallic taste in my mouth that I'd attributed to new medication. Now I was wondering how many times my son had sat in this kitchen, watching me consume whatever poison he'd carefully measured out, waiting for me to die so he could collect on a life insurance policy I barely remembered the details of. The thought made me physically sick, not just with revulsion but with a deeper kind of nausea that came from having to completely reorganize my understanding of my own life. How long had this been going on? How many times had Felix looked at me and seen not his mother, not the woman who'd given birth to him and raised him and sacrificed for him, but a financial obstacle that needed to be removed? How many times had he calculated dosages and timelines while I chatted about his job or his children or asked if he was eating enough? I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the past few months, all the times he'd seemed distracted or impatient, checking his watch or his phone while I talked. I'd attributed it to the normal preoccupations of a busy adult, the way grown children sometimes humor their aging parents without really listening. I'd made excuses for his behavior, told myself that he was stressed about work or worried about money, that he loved me even if he didn't always show it in the ways I wanted. But now I realized he hadn't been distracted or impatient. He'd been monitoring me, watching for signs that his poison was working, calculating whether he needed to adjust his dosage or his frequency. He'd been treating our relationship like a scientific experiment, and I was the test subject. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. This was the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler who'd clung to my legs when I tried to leave him at preschool, the teenager who'd come to me with his broken heart when Judith Martinez rejected him for the homecoming dance. I'd sacrificed everything for this child, my career, my friendships, my own sense of self, and he was trying to murder me for money. But alongside the hurt, something else was building in my chest. Something cold and furious and precise. Because Felix had made one crucial mistake in his calculations, he'd underestimated his mother. What he didn't know, what nobody in my family knew because I'd spent decades being the quiet, accommodating woman they expected me to be, was that I wasn't just Robert's widow scraping by on Social Security. When Robert died, I'd discovered things, bank accounts I'd never known about. investment portfolios managed by financial advisors I'd never met, property deeds with my name on them, signed years ago during one of Robert's tax planning phases, documents I'd obediently signed without reading, because women don't need to worry about these things, Clara. It turned out my dead husband had been quite wealthy, and thanks to laws I'd never bothered to learn about, most of it had become mine. The house I thought we'd been struggling to pay for, owned outright. The small life insurance policy Robert had maintained, $3.7 million. The retirement accounts he'd always claimed were just getting by, worth more than most people make in a lifetime. The discovery had been overwhelming at first. Robert had died suddenly, a heart attack at 68, right there in his home office while reviewing some financial documents that I'd never been allowed to see. The funeral had been a blur of arrangements and condolences and legal procedures that I'd navigated in a fog of grief and shock. It wasn't until weeks later, when the lawyer called to discuss the estate, that I'd learned the truth about our financial situation. "Mrs. Caldwell," he'd said, settling into Robert's leather chair in the office I'd barely ever entered, "your husband was quite thorough in his financial planning. There are several accounts and investments that we need to discuss." He'd spread papers across the desk, bank statements, investment summaries, insurance policies, property deeds, and I'd stared at the numbers with complete incomprehension. There were so many zeros, so many documents with my name on them, so many assets I'd never known existed. "I don't understand," I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Robert always said we were just getting by. He said we needed to be careful with money, that we couldn't afford luxuries. He said—" I'd stopped, remembering all the times I'd asked about finances and been told not to worry my pretty head about such things. All the times I'd wanted to spend money on something and been made to feel guilty and frivolous. The lawyer had looked uncomfortable, shifting papers around on the desk. "Mrs. Caldwell, your husband was very controlling about financial information, but legally, as his wife, you were entitled to know about these assets. You actually co-signed many of these accounts years ago, though I suspect you may not remember the details." He'd been right, as he'd walked me through the paperwork. I'd had vague memories of signing documents over the years, always with Robert explaining that it was just routine paperwork, or tax stuff that you don't need to understand. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning why my signature was needed if the accounts weren't really mine. But they were mine. All of it. Robert had structured everything as joint assets, probably for tax purposes, which meant that upon his death, I'd inherited not just his half but ownership of the entire portfolio. I was worth millions, literally millions, and I'd been living like a pauper because my husband had convinced me we were poor. I'd spent the past 3 years quietly learning about money, working with Robert's financial advisor, a sharp woman named Patricia Flake, who'd been frustrated for years by Robert's refusal to let me participate in financial decisions. Patricia had been patient and thorough, teaching me about investments and trusts and estate planning, teaching me how to protect myself. More importantly, Patricia had helped me understand exactly what Felix was trying to do. Because the life insurance policy Felix had convinced me to sign wasn't the first one. There had been others, smaller ones that I'd signed over the past year, each time with Felix explaining it as prudent planning, as his way of taking care of me. Patricia had shown me how to track them, how to see the pattern. 5 different policies with 5 different companies, each one naming Felix as the sole beneficiary, each one worth more than the last. The most recent policy, the big one worth $2 million, had been signed just 6 weeks ago. And according to Patricia's research, most life insurance companies have a 2-year contestability period for suicide, but immediate payouts for accidental death. If I died of apparent natural causes, say from what appeared to be a heart attack or stroke brought on by gradual poisoning, Felix would collect every penny without question. My son wasn't just trying to kill me. He was methodically, systematically planning to profit from my death, and he'd been at it for over a year. I set the coffee cup down again, this time with just a little tremor in my hand, as if I was struggling to hold it steady. Felix leaned forward, slightly, his attention sharpening. I could see the anticipation in his face, the way he was watching for signs that whatever he'd given me was taking effect. The sight of his eagerness, the barely concealed excitement as he waited for his mother to start dying, hit me like a physical blow. But it also crystallized something inside me, hardened my resolve in a way that nothing else could have. This man sitting across from me, watching me with predatory patience, was not my son, not anymore. My son had died somewhere along the way, replaced by this cold-eyed stranger who saw me as nothing more than a financial opportunity. I'm feeling a little dizzy, I murmured, pressing my hand to my forehead. It wasn't entirely a lie. The rage and shock were making me lightheaded. Maybe I should lie down. Are you okay, Mom? Felix asked, but there was something hungry in his voice, something eager. Do you need me to call anyone? Call anyone. Like an ambulance, perhaps, so he could play the grieving son when the paramedics arrived to find his mother dead or dying. So he could sob convincingly about how she'd been feeling poorly lately, how this was so sudden, how devastating it was for the family. I imagined the scene he'd probably rehearsed in his mind, himself calling 911, his voice choked with emotion as he explained that his elderly mother had suddenly collapsed, that she'd been complaining of feeling unwell, but he'd never expected anything like this. The paramedics would arrive to find me unconscious or dead, and Felix would be there to provide all the context they needed. His sick, aging mother, who'd been struggling since his father's death, who'd seemed to be declining rapidly over the past few weeks. The autopsy would show heart failure or stroke, both conditions common in women my age, both easily explained by the stress of widowhood and age-related health issues. The poison would be long gone from my system by then, metabolized and excreted, leaving no trace of Felix's involvement. He'd plan a beautiful funeral, accept condolences from neighbors who'd comment on what a devoted son he'd been, visiting his mother so frequently in her final weeks. And then he'd collect millions of dollars in insurance money and get on with his life. It was a good plan. A thorough plan. The kind of plan that only works if your victim is exactly as helpless and naive as you think she is. But Felix had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd based his entire scheme on the assumption that I was the same woman I'd been for the past 47 years. Passive, trusting, dependent on others to make decisions and solve problems for me. He had no idea that Robert's death had changed me, that discovering the truth about our finances had awakened something in me that had been dormant for decades. No, I said, standing slowly and letting myself sway just a little. I think I just need to rest. You don't need to stay, sweetheart. I know you're busy. I could see the conflict in his face. The desire to stay and witness his handiwork versus the need to establish an alibi, to be somewhere else when whatever he had given me finished its work. Calculation won out. Are you sure? He asked, already reaching for his jacket. I could stick around, make sure you're okay. The concern in his voice was so perfectly modulated, so convincingly worried, that if I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been touched by his apparent devotion. But I could hear the falseness underneath it now, the performance quality that meant he was saying what he thought the situation required rather than what he actually felt. I'm sure, I said, walking him to the front door with careful, measured steps. Thank you for the coffee. It was very thoughtful. He kissed my cheek, actually kissed my cheek, and I had to fight every instinct not to recoil from his touch. His lips felt cold against my skin, and I wondered if this was how lambs felt when wolves nuzzled them just before the killing bite. I love you, Mom, he said, and the words sounded like a eulogy. I love you too, I replied automatically, because even knowing what he was trying to do to me, even with the taste of poison still bitter on my tongue, he was still my son. The love was still there, twisted and broken and bleeding, but still there. That might have been the cruelest part of all, that you can love someone completely and still recognize that they're trying to destroy you, that the love doesn't make the betrayal hurt less, but actually makes it hurt more. I watched from the window as he drove away, noting the way he checked his watch as he got into his car, the way he seemed to be calculating something. Probably timing how long it would take for whatever he'd given me to work, when he could safely return to check on me and discover my body. Then I walked calmly to the kitchen and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I scrubbed the cup with hot soapy water, then scrubbed it again. Then I called Patricia Flake. Patricia, I said when she answered, my voice surprisingly steady, I think I need to implement that plan we discussed. There was a brief pause. Patricia Flake was not a woman who shocked easily. She'd been managing wealthy clients' affairs for over 20 years, dealing with everything from messy divorces to corporate embezzlement. But when I'd first told her about Felix's sudden interest in life insurance policies, about the way he'd been pushing me to sign documents I didn't understand, her face had gone very still and very serious. Are you safe right now? She asked, and I could hear her shifting into crisis mode, the way she probably did when clients called with urgent problems. Yes, he's gone. But, Patricia, I think he's escalating. I think he tried to. I stopped, the words catching in my throat. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that simply knowing it wasn't. I think he tried to poison me today. I'm calling my attorney, Patricia said immediately. And I'm calling someone else. Don't eat or drink anything that you haven't prepared yourself. Don't let anyone into the house. Can you do that? Yes, I said, and I meant it. I'd spent decades being the accommodating woman who never said no, who never made waves, who always put everyone else's needs first. But that woman was gone now, killed as surely as if Felix had succeeded with whatever he'd put in my coffee. What was left was someone harder, someone who'd been forged in the fire of absolute betrayal and had emerged as something my son had never imagined his mild-mannered mother could become. Patricia's attorney arrived within 2 hours, and he brought reinforcements. His name was James Morrison, and he specialized in elder abuse cases, a specialty I hadn't even known existed until Patricia explained that financial exploitation of elderly parents by their adult children was far more common than most people realized. James was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes and a way of listening that made me feel like every word I said mattered, like my experience was important rather than something to be dismissed or minimized. With him was a woman who introduced herself as Detective Judith Martinez. Yes, the same last name as the girl who'd broken Felix's heart in high school, though I was fairly certain it was a coincidence. Detective Martinez was probably in her early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of steady competence that made me feel safer just having her in the room. Mrs. Caldwell, James said, settling into the same chair where Felix had sat just hours earlier, watching me drink poison. Patricia filled me in on the situation. I need you to tell me everything, starting from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how insignificant it might seem. So I did. I told him about the multiple life insurance policies, about Felix's sudden interest in my well-being, about the weeks of feeling sick and the coffee that had tasted wrong. I told him about overhearing Felix on the phone last week, talking to someone about how much longer this was going to take, and whether the old bat was ever going to kick the bucket. I hadn't understood at the time. I'd thought he was talking about work, maybe dealing with a difficult client or waiting for some kind of business deal to go through. Now I realized he'd been talking about me, discussing my murder with someone else as casually as if he were planning a vacation. Detective Martinez took notes throughout my story, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times and specific details. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Mrs. Caldwell, what you're describing is attempted murder. The question is how we prove it and how we keep you safe while we gather evidence. What do you mean, keep me safe? I mean your son is going to expect you to be dead or dying very soon. When that doesn't happen, when you're still alive and healthy tomorrow and the next day, he's likely to try again. And next time, he might not be so subtle about it. The reality of that settled over me like ice water. Felix wouldn't just give up. He'd invested too much time, taken too many risks, gotten too close to his goal. If I survived this attempt, he'd try again and again until he succeeded or got caught. What do we do? I asked. James smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe I wasn't facing it alone. We're going to set a trap, and we're going to use Felix's own greed and impatience against him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, though it required me to become an actress in the performance of my life. We would let Felix think his poison had worked, but slowly. Instead of a quick death, I would appear to be gradually declining, getting sicker and weaker over the next few days. This would give us time to gather evidence while keeping me safe from another attempt. Patricia arranged for me to stay in a secure location, a beautiful apartment in a luxury senior living community where the staff were trained to recognize and prevent elder abuse. To anyone watching, I would simply appear to be recuperating from a sudden illness, staying somewhere with round-the-clock medical care. Meanwhile, James worked on getting legal authorization to monitor Felix's communications and financial activities. Detective Martinez coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure that when we caught Felix in the act, the charges would stick. And most importantly, they contacted a private investigator who specialized in cases like mine. Her name was Maria Santos, and she was exactly the kind of woman I wished I'd been 40 years ago. Confident, decisive, afraid of no one. She'd been a police detective before starting her own agency, and she understood predators in a way that I was just beginning to learn. The thing about family members who try to kill for inheritance, Maria explained during our first meeting, is that they always get sloppy. They think because it's family, because they know you, because they've been getting away with emotional manipulation for years, that they're smarter than they are. Your son has been planning this for months, maybe longer. That means there's a trail. She was right. Within 72 hours, Maria had uncovered Felix's financial situation, and it was worse than I'd imagined. He owed money to a loan shark. Serious money, the kind where people break bones if you don't pay. He'd gambled away his children's college funds. He'd borrowed against his house twice and was facing foreclosure. He was 3 months behind on his car payments and had maxed out every credit card he could get his hands on. Felix was facing complete financial ruin, and the only thing standing between him and bankruptcy, or worse, was my death. But Maria had also found something else, something that made my blood run cold. Felix had been researching poisons for months. His internet search history, obtained through legal channels I didn't pretend to understand, showed months of research into substances that could cause gradual organ failure, that could mimic natural illness, that wouldn't show up in a standard autopsy unless someone was specifically looking for them. He'd researched dosages and delivery methods. He'd looked up the symptoms of various types of poisoning and how to make them appear like natural health problems in elderly people. He'd even researched grief counseling and funeral planning, as if he was already planning his performance as the devastated son. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a carefully planned murder executed over months, with contingencies and backup plans and meticulous attention to detail. He'd planned this so carefully, so methodically, and he'd almost gotten away with it. The good news, James told me during our third meeting, is that we have enough evidence to press charges. The bad news is that we need to catch him in the act to make the charges stick. Intent is hard to prove in court unless we can show him actually attempting to harm you. What does that mean? It means we need to give him another opportunity. Under controlled circumstances, with law enforcement present, we need to let him try again. The thought of sitting across from my son again, of pretending to drink whatever poison he brought me, of looking into his eyes knowing he was trying to kill me, it made me physically sick. But it also made me angry in a way I'd never been angry before. I'd spent my entire life being afraid. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of making waves. Afraid of standing up for myself. I'd let Robert control me for decades because I was afraid of being alone. I'd let Felix manipulate me for years because I was afraid of losing his love. But what I discovered over the past week was that there were worse things than being alone. There were worse things than losing someone's love. Being murdered by your own child, for instance. That was definitely worse. Okay, I told James, what do we do? The plan required me to play a role I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire life. The weak, vulnerable, slowly dying woman. It should have been easy. After all, I'd spent decades pretending to be helpless and dependent, accommodating everyone else's needs at the expense of my own. Instead, it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, because now I knew what I was really capable of when I stopped pretending to be powerless. I called Felix on a Thursday morning, letting my voice shake just a little. Felix, honey, I'm not feeling very well. I think that coffee yesterday made me sick. Could you maybe come by? I think I might need to go to the doctor. He was at my house within 30 minutes, which told me he'd been waiting for this call. He brought coffee again, a different brand this time, but the same solicitous smile, the same careful attention to making sure I drank every drop. What he didn't know was that Maria's cameras were recording everything from multiple angles. What he didn't know was that James was parked outside in an unmarked van with Detective Martinez, both of them wearing earpieces that let them monitor everything happening in my kitchen in real time. What he didn't know was that I'd learned to palm small objects without anyone noticing, a skill I'd picked up from a magic tutorial video Patricia had found online, of all things. The plastic wrap technique she'd taught me was even simpler. A tiny piece of clear film that I could press across the rim of a cup with my thumb, creating an invisible barrier that kept liquid from actually entering my mouth while creating the perfect illusion of drinking. I watched my son watch me drink poison for the second time in a week, and this time I was able to see him clearly, without the fog of shock and disbelief that had clouded my vision the first time. The anticipation in his posture, the way he kept checking his watch, the barely contained excitement when I started to complain of dizziness and nausea. He was enjoying this. That was the detail that cut deepest, the realization that Felix wasn't just killing me for money, he was getting genuine pleasure from watching me suffer. There was something almost sexual about his attention, the way he focused on my face as I pretended to struggle with the effects of whatever he'd given me. Mom, I think we should call an ambulance, we said, but he made no move toward the phone. Instead, he leaned forward, watching me with predatory fascination. No, I said, letting myself slump forward slightly. I think I just need to lie down. Maybe you should go, though. I don't want you to catch anything if I'm getting sick." The relief in his face was unmistakable, and so was the disappointment. He'd wanted to stay and watch me die, I realized. He'd wanted to be there for the actual moment, to see the life leave his mother's eyes. "Are you sure? I could stay with you?" "I'm sure," I said, standing up slowly and swaying dramatically. "I'll call you if I need anything." He hugged me goodbye, actually hugged me, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. But I held on long enough to slip a small recording device into his jacket pocket, another gift from Maria's extensive collection of surveillance equipment. 20 minutes after Felix left, the police were at my door with a search warrant. They found the poison in his car, antifreeze, the same substance he'd been putting in my coffee for weeks, carefully measured and stored in what looked like a prescription bottle. They found the syringe he'd used to inject it into the coffee. They found his notebook with dosage calculations and timelines, written in his own handwriting. Most damning of all, they found the recording device I'd planted, which had captured Felix on the phone with his bookie, bragging about how the old bitch will be dead by tonight, and how he'd finally be able to pay off his debts. They arrested him at his office in front of his coworkers in handcuffs. Maria was there to witness it, and she told me later that when they read him his rights, when they told him he was being charged with attempted murder, his face went completely white. "He kept saying it was impossible, Maria reported. That you were supposed to be dead, that the timing was all wrong, that something must have gone wrong with his calculations. He seemed more upset about the failure of his plan than about the fact that he'd been caught trying to murder his mother. His calculations, as if my death was nothing more than a math problem he'd been working on. The trial took 8 months. 8 months of Felix's lawyers trying to paint me as a confused old woman who'd misunderstood her son's innocent concern for her health. 8 months of them trying to explain away the poison, the life insurance policies, the internet search history, the recorded conversations where Felix discussed my death with casual indifference. But Maria had done her job well. James had done his job well. Patricia had protected my assets and my interests throughout the entire process, and I had done something I'd never done before in my life. I had stood up for myself completely and without compromise. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't just hear about Felix's financial desperation and his research into poisons. They heard the recordings of him calling me names, discussing my death like a business transaction, expressing frustration that I was taking so long to die. They heard testimony from the bookie who'd been threatening Felix with physical violence if he didn't pay his debts. They heard from insurance agents who testified about the suspicious pattern of policies Felix had convinced me to sign. Most importantly, they heard from me. I took the stand and told my story in my own words, without euphemisms or excuses or attempts to minimize what my son had tried to do to me. I looked the jury in the eyes and described the taste of poison in my coffee, the calculation in my son's face as he watched me drink it, the months of gradually declining health that I now knew had been caused by systematic poisoning. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, elder abuse, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges I barely understood. Felix was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He never looked at me during the sentencing, not once. Even when I gave my victim impact statement, when I spoke about the betrayal and the fear and the way he'd stolen not just my security but my ability to trust, he stared straight ahead as if I wasn't there. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some betrayals are so complete that there's nothing left to salvage, not even the pretense of love. I'm 72 now, and I live in a beautiful house in a different state, far away from the kitchen where my son sat watching me drink poison. Patricia helped me set up trusts and foundations that will distribute my wealth to causes I care about. Elder abuse prevention, women's shelters, scholarship funds for students whose parents can't afford college. Felix will never see a penny of my money. Not one single penny. In fact, I've made sure that his conviction for attempting to murder me has voided every single life insurance policy he convinced me to sign. The insurance companies were more than happy to cancel the policies and refund the premiums once they learned about the criminal case. Apparently, they take a very dim view of beneficiaries who try to murder their way to payouts. But more than that, I've used my newfound knowledge of estate planning to ensure that Felix's children, my grandchildren, will be taken care of despite their father's crimes. They're innocent in all of this, and they shouldn't suffer because their father is a monster. I've established education trusts for both of them, funds that will pay for college and graduate school and help them build better lives than the one their father tried to finance with my death. The irony isn't lost on me. Felix tried to kill me to get money to pay his debts and secure his future. Instead, he lost everything: his freedom, his family, his children's respect, and any hope of inheriting anything from me. Meanwhile, his attempt to murder me led me to discover just how wealthy I actually was, which gave me the resources to ensure his children would be provided for despite his failures. He gambled everything on my death and ended up ensuring his own destruction. I've made new friends here in my new city, women my age who've also survived betrayals and losses and emerged stronger. We meet for coffee twice a week, real coffee, prepared by people who love me rather than people who want to kill me. And we share stories about our lives, our children, our hard-won wisdom. Some of them have dealt with difficult adult children too, though none quite as dramatic as my situation. There's Martha, whose daughter tried to have her declared mentally incompetent to steal her house. There's Ruth, whose son cleaned out her bank account while she was recovering from surgery. There's Eleanor, whose daughter-in-law convinced her to sign over power of attorney and then sold everything she owned. We call ourselves the Phoenix Club because we've all risen from the ashes of our former lives. We play bridge and take art classes and travel together to places I never thought I'd see. I'm learning to paint, terribly but enthusiastically. I'm learning to speak Spanish. I'm learning that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you're not trying to please everyone around you. Most importantly, I'm learning what real love looks like. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. Real love doesn't ask you to ignore red flags or make excuses for bad behavior. Real love doesn't count down the minutes until you die so it can inherit your money. I have real love now with Patricia, who's become like the daughter I never had, calling me every week just to chat, including me in her family celebrations, treating me like a valued friend rather than a client. I have real love with Maria, who still checks on me regularly and shares stories of her latest cases, who treats me like a colleague in the fight against elder abuse rather than just another victim who needed rescuing. I have real love with the women in my Phoenix Club, who celebrate my strength instead of trying to exploit my weaknesses, who encourage my growth instead of trying to keep me small and manageable. I have real love with my new neighbors, who invite me to their barbecues and ask my opinion on their garden designs and treat me like a valued member of the community rather than a burden to be managed. It took me 71 years to learn the difference between real love and its counterfeits, but I learned it just in time. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't noticed the bitter taste in that coffee, if I'd been less observant or more trusting. Felix's plan might have worked perfectly. I might have died slowly, seemingly of natural causes, with my son playing the grieving beneficiary, collecting millions while crying crocodile tears at my funeral. The thought doesn't terrify me the way it once did. Instead, it makes me grateful, not just for surviving, but for discovering what I was capable of when pushed beyond my limits. For 71 years, I thought of myself as weak, dependent, someone who needed to be taken care of by stronger people. I'd accepted other people's definitions of who I was and what I was worth. But when faced with the ultimate test, when my very survival depended on it, I discovered that the woman I thought was helpless was actually nothing of the sort. She was just a woman who'd never been given the chance, or forced by circumstances, to find out what she was made of. Now I know, and now Felix knows too, wherever he is in whatever cell they've put him in for the next 25 years. He knows that he didn't just fail to kill his mother. He revealed exactly who his mother really was underneath all those years of quiet accommodation. He revealed someone much stronger than either of us had ever imagined. I keep the newspaper clipping from his sentencing in my jewelry box, not because I want to remember the pain, but because I want to remember the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. The moment I looked evil in the face, evil wearing my son's features, and refused to let it win. The headline reads, "Local man sentenced to 25 years for attempting to poison mother." It's a small story, tucked away on page 6 of the local section. To most people reading it, it was probably just another sad tale of family dysfunction, something to shake their heads over before turning to the sports scores. But to me, that headline represents the most important victory of my life. Not because I got revenge on Felix, though I'll admit there's satisfaction in knowing he's facing the consequences of his choices, but because I finally learned to value myself enough to fight for my own life. For decades, I'd been so focused on being lovable, on being needed, on being useful to other people, that I'd forgotten the most fundamental truth. I was worth protecting. My life had value that existed independent of what I could do for other people. I deserved to be safe, to be respected, to live without fear of the people who were supposed to love me most. It seems like such a simple realization, but it was revolutionary for me. For the first time in my adult life, I put my own safety and well-being first, not because I was being selfish, but because I finally understood that I mattered. The other thing I keep in my jewelry box is a letter. Not from Felix. He's never written to me from prison, never apologized, never acknowledged what he tried to do. I don't expect him to. Sociopaths rarely develop consciences just because they get caught. The letter is from his daughter, my granddaughter Judith, who's now 20 years old and in college thanks to the education trust I established for her. She wrote to me 6 months after Felix's sentencing, a beautiful, heartbreaking letter in which she apologized for her father's actions and thanked me for still caring about her and her brother despite everything. Grandma Clara, she wrote, I don't understand how my dad could have done what he did to you. You were always so kind to us, so generous, so loving. I'm ashamed that he's my father, but I'm proud that you're my grandmother. Thank you for not letting his actions destroy our relationship. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. That letter means more to me than any material wealth I've accumulated. It tells me that something good came out of this nightmare, that Felix's children learned something valuable from watching their grandmother refuse to be a victim. It tells me that the cycle of manipulation and exploitation that Robert started and Felix continued doesn't have to continue to the next generation. Judith visits me sometimes, driving down from her university for weekend visits where we cook together and talk about her studies and her dreams for the future. She's nothing like her father. She's honest and hardworking and genuinely kind, the way Felix used to pretend to be. She asks me about my life, my history, my opinions on everything from politics to recipes to career choices. She treats me like a person whose thoughts and experiences have value, not like a relic to be managed or an obstacle to be overcome. Her brother Michael is more hesitant, more damaged by discovering what his father really was. He's in therapy, working through the trauma of learning that the man he'd looked up to was a would-be murderer. But he sends me cards on my birthday and Mother's Day, awkward but sincere notes that let me know he's thinking of me, that he doesn't blame me for his father's imprisonment. I don't know if our relationship will ever be fully healed. There's too much pain, too much betrayal, too much complicated history. But I know that Felix's attempt to destroy our family actually ended up saving it, because it forced all of us to confront the truth about who he really was and what he was really capable of. The truth was ugly and painful and devastating, but it was also liberating. I think about this sometimes when I'm in my garden, planting flowers that I'll actually live to see bloom, tending plants that no one is secretly hoping will die. There's something profound about the act of planting when you know you'll be around for the harvest, about investing in a future that you expect to inhabit. For so many years, I lived like I was already dead, like my life was just a waiting period before the real business of dying could begin. I made decisions based on what other people wanted, sacrificed my own desires for the comfort of people who saw me as expendable, treated my own existence as if it were less important than everyone else's convenience. But Felix's attempt to kill me paradoxically brought me back to life. It forced me to recognize that I had a choice. I could continue being the passive victim that everyone expected me to be, or I could become someone else entirely. Someone who fought back. Someone who refused to go quietly into that good night. I chose to fight, and in fighting, I discovered parts of myself I'd never known existed. Now, at 72, I'm more alive than I've been since I was 23 years old and working as a secretary, supporting myself, making my own decisions, believing in my own possibilities. I have that feeling back now, the sense that my life belongs to me, that I get to decide what happens next, that there are still adventures waiting and dreams worth pursuing. Last month, I signed up for a cooking class focused on cuisines from around the world. I'm planning a trip to Italy in the fall with 2 of the women from my Phoenix Club. I'm considering getting a small dog, something I never could do while Robert was alive because he was allergic, something I never did after he died because Felix kept telling me it was too much responsibility for someone my age. These might sound like small things, ordinary pleasures that most people take for granted. But for me, they represent a revolution. Every choice I make for myself, every plan I make based on what I want rather than what other people expect, is an act of rebellion against the woman I used to be. I'm not bitter about the years I lost to Robert's control or Felix's manipulation. Bitterness is just another form of prison, and I've spent enough time locked away from my own life. Instead, I'm grateful for the time I have left and determined to make the most of it. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my son, if I ever consider visiting him in prison, if I think I'll forgive him someday. They ask these questions with such earnest concern, as if forgiveness is something I owe him, as if moving on requires me to excuse what he tried to do. The answer is complicated. I miss the child he was, the boy who used to fall asleep in my arms during thunderstorms, the teenager who cried when our dog died. I mourn that child as surely as if he had died, because in a way, he had. The man who sat in my kitchen calculating my death, that's not my son. That's someone wearing his face, but the soul behind it became unrecognizable somewhere along the way. Do I forgive him? I don't know. But I've learned that forgiveness isn't about him. It's about me, about choosing not to carry the poison of his betrayal in my heart for the rest of my life. I've learned that you can release anger without excusing the person who caused it. You can heal without pretending the wound never happened. Most importantly, I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I can let go of my hatred for Felix without letting him back into my life. I can wish him well without trusting him ever again. I can mourn the relationship we might have had without endangering myself by trying to resurrect it. The Felix who sits in prison now is not the same person as the child I raised, but he's also not a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He made choices, deliberate, calculated choices, and he has to live with the consequences of those choices. My job is not to rescue him from those consequences or to minimize the harm he tried to cause. My job is to protect myself and to live the life he tried to take away from me. And I'm doing that. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful house, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, I'm living the life Felix tried to steal. Every time I laugh with my Phoenix Club friends or learn something new or make plans for the future, I'm defeating his attempt to reduce me to nothing more than a financial opportunity. He wanted me dead so he could take my money and pay his debts and continue living irresponsibly without consequences. Instead, I'm more alive than ever. My money is being used for causes I care about, and he's the one facing consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. The irony is perfect, and I don't feel guilty about appreciating it. Recently, I've started volunteering with an organization that helps elderly people recognize and report financial abuse by family members. It's more common than most people realize. Adult children stealing from aging parents, relatives manipulating elderly family members into signing over assets, caregivers gradually gaining control of their clients' finances. Most of the victims are women like I used to be, isolated, trusting, raised to believe that family loyalty means never questioning the motives of the people closest to you. They've spent their lives putting other people's needs first, and they can't imagine that their own children might see them as nothing more than financial resources to be exploited. I tell them my story, not to shock them, but to show them that survival is possible, that fighting back is an option, that they don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from someone they love. I help them understand that real love doesn't require them to submit to their own destruction. Some of them listen. Some of them find the courage to set boundaries, to seek legal help, to protect themselves from the people who are supposed to care about them most. Others aren't ready to hear it yet. The betrayal is too fresh, the love too deep, the hope for reconciliation too strong. I understand that. I was once where they are, unable to imagine that my child could be capable of such calculated cruelty. But I plant seeds, and sometimes those seeds grow into the strength they'll need when they're ready to save themselves. This work has given my life a new sense of purpose. I'm not just a survivor anymore. I'm someone who helps other people become survivors too. My experience with Felix, horrible as it was, has become something I can use to help others recognize the warning signs I missed, avoid the traps I fell into, find the resources they need to protect themselves. In a strange way, Felix's attempt to destroy me has led to the most meaningful work of my life. He tried to reduce me to nothing, and instead, he helped me discover a calling I never knew I had. That might be the ultimate revenge, not that he's in prison, not that he lost everything he was trying to steal, but that his worst act became the catalyst for my greatest transformation. He tried to write the ending to my story, and instead he helped me begin an entirely new chapter. I'm 72 years old, and I'm just getting started. There's something liberating about reaching this age and realizing that you don't have to spend your remaining years trying to fix relationships that were never healthy to begin with, or maintaining connections with people who fundamentally don't value you, or pretending that blood relations automatically deserve loyalty regardless of how they treat you. I've given myself permission to choose my family now. Patricia and Maria and the women in my Phoenix Club, they're my real family. They're the people who celebrate my victories, support me through challenges, respect my opinions, and value my presence in their lives. They're the people who would never dream of harming me for personal gain, who see my continued existence as a blessing rather than an inconvenience. That's what real love looks like. That's what healthy relationships feel like. And I'm grateful that I lived long enough to experience it. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and I'm sitting in my favorite chair with a cup of tea I made myself, tea that contains nothing but chamomile and honey and good intentions, I think about the alternate timeline where Felix's plan worked. In that timeline, I died fully and painfully, probably confused and frightened, probably still making excuses for him until the very end. In that timeline, he collected millions of dollars while playing the grieving son, and no one ever knew what he'd really done. But that's not this timeline. In this timeline, I noticed the bitter taste of poison and chose to fight back. In this timeline, I discovered strengths I never knew I had and resources I never knew existed. In this timeline, I'm alive and thriving while Felix faces the consequences of his choices. In this timeline, I win, and every morning when I wake up, every evening when I go to sleep safe in my own bed, every moment of joy and peace and contentment I experience, all of it is a victory over the man who thought his mother was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I've learned that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is to become everything they never imagined you could be. The best response to those who try to diminish you is to grow beyond their wildest expectations. The best answer to those who count you out is to live so fully, so joyfully, so completely that your very existence becomes a celebration of everything they tried to destroy. Felix tried to kill me, and instead, he taught me how to truly live. For that lesson, unintended though it was, I suppose I should thank him, but I won't because he doesn't deserve my gratitude any more than he deserved my death. Instead, I'll thank myself for noticing the bitter taste, for trusting my instincts, for finding the courage to fight back, for refusing to be the victim he expected me to be. I'll thank the woman I discovered I was capable of becoming, strong, resourceful, uncompromising in her refusal to accept less than she deserved. I'll thank the life I built from the ashes of his betrayal, the friendships I formed from the foundation of my survival, the purpose I found in helping others find their own strength. Felix wanted to take everything from me, and instead he gave me everything I never knew I needed. He showed me what I was made of. He taught me what real love looks like by showing me its opposite. He forced me to discover resources I didn't know I had. He pushed me to become someone I never imagined I could be. In trying to destroy me, he created me. And now, at 72, I finally know who Clara Caldwell really is. Not Robert's controlled wife, not Felix's enabling mother, not anyone's victim or caretaker or convenience. Just Clara. Strong, smart, independent Clara, who tastes her coffee carefully and trusts her instincts and fights back when threatened and builds a life worth living from whatever materials she has at hand. Clara who survived, who thrived, who turned the tables so completely that the predator became the prey and the intended victim became the victor. Clara who learned that it's never too late to save yourself, as long as you're willing to recognize that you're worth saving. That recognition, that I am worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the effort it takes to build a life of dignity and joy and meaningful connection, that might be the most important lesson of all. It's a lesson I learned at 71 from the most unlikely teacher imaginable, but I learned it just in time. And now, every day I have left is a day Felix thought I wouldn't see. Every single one of them is a victory.